Pirate history is strange in that a large part of it is not dedicated to learning about pirates, but learning about what not to learn about pirates. Much of the true history has been perverted and romanticized into a form almost unrecognizable. Most of the blame can ultimately be put on a little book published 300 years ago in 1724, A General History of the Pirates. And this strange piece of work is part historical account, part fiction, and part allegorical propaganda. It was written as a sort of true crime, pop history never intended for serious historical research. Yet, it has subsequently been treated as a serious source. Aside from history, its footprint can be felt across pirate pop culture. One-legged scalawags, buxom buccaneer babes, freedom-fighting filibusters, the liberation of slaves, rebellion against an empire, and a flag called the Jolly Roger. All of it stems from these dog-eared and ink-blotted pages. The effect and importance of this book has given it a controversial status in the pirate community. Some love it, others hate it. Whatever your opinion might be, it is an object of utmost fascination, and a source of what might be pirate history's biggest mystery. No one knows who wrote it. The book is attributed to a certain Captain Charles Johnson, a name which no one has successfully traced. In this video, we will take a deep dive into the crummy pages of pirate history, and try to uncover the identity of this magnanimous mystery man, the true profiteer of the Golden Age, a pirate of the printing press. Captain Johnson was not his real name. Well, it might have been. I cannot prove that there isn't a teapot named Captain Charles Johnson spinning around the sun, spewing out bad history books. But historians have been unable to find any historical person going by this identity, and you'd be surprised over how easy it is. So it was most likely a pen name, taken from the famous playwright Charles Johnson, who wrote a popular piece on Henry Every. The captain moniker was added to give the book some maritime legitimacy, perhaps to compare it to some of the privateers' travel accounts, written by men like Captain Woodes Rogers. And more than likely, the author's actual name was so controversial as to deter potential sales, but his actual identity remains uncertain. The classical theory goes that Captain Charles Johnson was in fact the pen name of the famous author, Daniel Defoe. You have probably heard of him. Defoe was one of history's most prolific authors, writing as many as 300 works, including but not limited to Journal of the Plague Year, Moll Flanders, and of course many concerning pirates, Captain Singleton, the King of the Pirates, and Robinson Crusoe. In 1932, literary scholar John Robert Moore claimed to have discovered Defoe's hand in A General History. He claimed that the style of language and moral reflections were typical of Defoe, and by the time of A General History's publishing, Defoe had become especially fascinated by pirates. Shortly after publishing Robinson Crusoe, he wrote a fictional autobiography of Henry Every, followed by Captain Singleton and several others. Moore's prestigious reputation led to a lot of publishers plastering Defoe's name upon their editions of the book. Indeed, the first copy I ever owned of it had Defoe's name on it, leading me to believe that Defoe had indeed written it. It wasn't until 1988 that Moore's supposition was challenged. P. N. Furbank and W. R. Owens pointed out a problem with Moore's approach of identifying Defoe's style of prose by gut feeling. They also identified inconsistencies between the narrative content of AGH and the periodical works of Defoe. So the mystery continued. In 2004, Arne Beloshevsky published a groundbreaking paper identifying Captain Charles Johnson as the alias of a former sailor and printer, Nathaniel Mist. This is where we can finally delve into the juiciest meat of our story, since Mist is one of the most fascinating figures from the period, and perhaps the biggest pirate himself. Nathaniel Mist was a Tory and a sworn Jacobite, much like the pirates he wrote about. The Jacobites were a rebellious faction who wished to restore the House of Stuart to the British throne. Their last monarch, James III, had recently been deposed by Parliament for the crime of being a Catholic. Instead, they invited a German elector, George Ludwig von Hanover, to become the new king, beginning a new, liberal age of the British kingdom. Mist and his fellow Jacobites were not happy over this. In order to make his opinions public, Mist began in 1716 to write a newspaper titled The Weekly Journal. It would soon become the go-to source of opposition opinions. The government wasn't entirely fond of this, and the status of free speech in 18th century England was dubious. Instead of immediately cracking down on the journal, which would have martyred it, they employed a bit of a psyop, sending in a familiar face, Daniel Defoe, as a spy to write for the paper and attempt to tone down its Jacobite voice. Defoe and Mist had actually been involved for several years, in writing, that is, not romantically, I think. The status of free speech in 18th century England was dubious. Mist often attempted to conceal his messages by using allegories and parallel history, using examples from Persian and English history to mask his critique. He would often use citations from John Locke, and yes, the government of pirates. In spite of his smoke and mirrors, he frequently got in trouble with the law. It is possible that Defoe helped him avoid arrest, but in 1718 it was revealed that Defoe had been involved in writing an article critiquing the conflict with Spain. At the same time, Defoe had been writing for a Whig paper, so his duplicitousness gave him a bit of critique, of the harsh, abusive, emotionally mauling sort. Defoe decided to cut ties with Mist, at least until 1719, when he agreed to write for the Weekly again, but perhaps with a more moderate tone. A few months later, the Weekly published a series of articles critiquing King George's support for Protestant refugees in the Palatinate. Here we have a sketchy, wealthy, conservative newsman critiquing refugees and a government more concerned with overseas than domestic affairs, and showing support for a controversial deposed politician who supported an armed uprising, and published a book in the year 1724. It's almost as if you could write an allegory yourself about it. These modern parallels are quite silly, and no one should take offense, but it's still funny to make them, both for a laugh and also to put ourselves in their shoes and maybe get a better understanding, or even a realization of how little we've changed. Anyway, the article basically proposed that George's interests lay outside of England, and not in the country in which he ruled. He was, after all, a foreigner, whose loyalties might lie in his home country. The House of Lords got quite upset over this article and brought Mr. Mist in for questioning. It is not certain how easily he squeezed out the answer, but Mist admitted to Defoe being the author of the article. Even though Defoe denied any involvement in the article, he was still made to pay a sizable fine. After this point, no evidence points to any future connections between Defoe and Mist. Defoe later claimed that Mist had insulted and physically fought him. Neither has much been documented about Mist after this point, apart from ensuring his paper sold and disputes with the authorities and rival publishers. It is uncertain how much writing he ever did personally for the paper. Historians have often assumed he did little to none, whereas Mist himself claimed he wrote 3 out of 4 articles, during his questioning regarding the Palatinate affair. Several letters from his later life have been preserved, showing that he had the ability to draft prose, which was both articulate and explicit. Even though Defoe was punished for writing the article, Mist did also receive his share of the spanking. He was tried before the court of the King's Bench and found guilty of scandalous reflections on the government. On the 13th of February, 1721, he was sentenced to stand twice in the pillory, spend 3 months in prison, pay a fine of £50, and give sureties for good behavior for 7 years. Placement in the pillory was far from pleasant, locked in an uncompromising position and subject to the whims of the crowd, rotten cabbages and worse. Fortunately for him, Mist had not only gone unharmed in the pillory, but crowds of Jacobites had gathered to support him, almost leading into riots. After the pillory, he was moved on to debtor's prison, where his creditors filed legal action against him for a sum of £500, prolonging his sentence. At the same time, an article was published in the Weekly, comparing the current political situation to 1642, the eve upon the brink of the English Civil War, leading to the deposing and decapitation of the king. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Mist, but when the officers raided his house, it was empty. Mist was already in debtor's confinement. They found him soon enough. It wasn't especially difficult, and if he had found his old confinements uncomfortable, Newgate would not prove any better. For 3 days they questioned him about the article, and for 3 days he claimed he knew not the author. He was committed as a close prisoner and deprived of any visits or use of the pen, ink, or paper. Mist eventually fell ill, and was moved back to the more favorable conditions of the debtor's prison, his trial postponed. He was eventually discharged, both because there wasn't any sufficient evidence against him, and because the Whigs didn't want to make him a Tory martyr just before the 1722 elections. Instead of making a big show out of it, the authorities went the more subtle route, silencing Mist by undermining his business, causing financial issues and eventual bankruptcy. Aside from government efforts to ruin him, the weekly was losing readers to its rivals. The London Journal gained substantial attention after covering the 1720 stock collapse of the South Sea Company, whereas the weekly had remained almost silent on the matter, probably to avoid further conflict with the law. Instead, the weekly decided to attack the London, which responded in August of 1721. The London Journal sells above 2 to his 1, and has done so in town and country for many months. If that isn't the worst burn a printer could receive, I know not what. Mist fought the law, and the law won. After being released from prison, he spent several months in Dorset to recover from his illness. His printing press was left in the hands of an incompetent youngling, and when he returned, he lamented his substantial losses. On a good year, the weekly could make almost £2,000 a year, but in a bad year, as in 1721 and 2, it went as low as 500 or 600. In addition to his court and prison fees, Mist ran a large household, which probably cost him between 400 to 500 annually. He had a wife and servants. In lieu of these monetary troubles, Mist was desperately searching for a way to earn a quick buck. He attempted to publish and monetize 2 other papers, but without much success. Perhaps this is when he conceived the idea of writing a general history. If he did. So, let's look at the evidence. Mist had actually been a sailor to the Caribbean, though it isn't certain when, nor what he did exactly. It isn't even certain when he was born, only that he died in 1737. Either way, his maritime experience gave him a personal and vested interest in the region, and during the height of piracy between 1716 and 1720, Mist printed a lot of articles about their attacks and misdeeds on the open sea. Indeed, a few other papers published as many news of piracy as he did, and the weekly's ability to combine information with entertainment made it popular among a large audience, a large number of whom were seafarers. In 1719 and 1720 were published the romanticized pirate novels The King of Pirates and Captain Singleton, but waning interest in these books shows that people were more interested in actual news and facts about pirates, and the gruesome reality of their deeds, something akin to modern true crime. The problem with the news was that they were scattered and often contradictory, and contained little more than the names of the commanders and a rough outline of events. Readers were no doubt curious to learn more, what the pirates were like, how they operated, what they did aboard their ships. Thus, there was a demand for a detailed, comprehensive narrative. Money could be made for the right man for the job. All of this, personal writing ability, knowledge and interest in maritime affairs in the Caribbean, monetary troubles and a controversial identity, points to Nathaniel being a likely candidate for wanting to anonymously publish an account of pirates. An especially alluring prospect is that he might have started work on the book when in prison. He would have been a cellmate of a certain Walter Kennedy, a crewman of Bartholomew Roberts, arrested in 1721, and he could have personally interviewed the locked-up pirate. It does sound quite romantic. 2 mariners sitting around a candle in a dank cell, the stones dripping with moisture, and the street bustling behind the bars. One of them a political printer, the other a pirate soon to be hanged. one leaning over a stack of papers with ink and quill, furiously scribbling, while the other babbles on in a rasp accent, occasionally pausing to swig from a bottle of brandy. Aside from educated guesswork and supposition, there is direct evidence of Nathaniel at least being the publisher of a general history. In 1724, a general history of the pirates was registered with the Stationers' Company for Nathaniel Mist. This is definite evidence that he at least owned the book, and that he was probably central in producing it. It would also go on to be distributed and sold by publishers who had previously had business connections to him, including Charles Rivington, who had often purchased ad placements in the weekly journal, and Mist had printed a few books for him. Rivington usually sold religious publications. His printing shop was called the Bible and Crown, so printing a crime novel was quite out of the ordinary. While some of the readers who went to Rivington's bookstore surely knew that Captain Charles Johnson was Mist, a lot of them probably did not, probably for the best. Even though Mist had received support when put in the pillory and prison, it had polarized the public against him, making it difficult to publish something with wider appeal under his name. Nor was it especially uncommon for 18th century authors to use aliases, especially if they intended for their books to make a profit. It is uncertain how many copies were initially sold, but Mist himself certainly made an effort to advertise it. Between May and June of 1724, his weekly journal carried several advertisements for a general history on the third page, whereas all other publications only had advertisements on the last pages. Mist also included 2 lengthy essays on a general history, the first one praising the mysterious author, saying he must have been among the pirates themselves. The second one, published just 2 weeks later, had a more serious tone, emphasizing the damage caused to British commerce, and a discussion on how to end piracy. Only 3 months after the first edition was published, a second edition came out in the bookstores, containing an enlarged manuscript. The price had also gone up by 1 shilling, indicating a demand for the salivating stories. However, subsequent editions did not perform especially well, many being left in storage before eventually disappearing altogether. A second volume of a general history did not emerge until 1728, the year after Mist had fled from England. The second volume certainly shows evidence of Mist's deteriorating situation. Piracy had virtually died out by 1726, resulting in a decline of fresh sources and stories to be told. So the second volume largely contains addendums to the stories of the first volume, more stories about Blackbeard, expanding and editing the backgrounds of Rackham, Barney and Reed, some of the details allegedly contributed by Woodes Rogers himself. It even had a story of a sailor, not even a pirate, held captive by the natives of West Africa. Most of the chapters concern various Red Sea pirates between 1695 and 1710. These stories are garbled and often dateless, containing amongst them the infamous tale of Captain Misson, who allegedly established a pirate republic on Madagascar called Libertalia, where everyone lived freely, regardless of religion or race. It resembles no other account, fictional or historical, and appears to be entirely made up, likely not even written by Mist himself. Some speculate on a French author. Indeed, it is possible that Mist might not even have written anything in a general history, or maybe just a handful of chapters. The style between the different chapters, and especially the 2 volumes, varies a lot, and at some points appears schizophrenic. At times it romanticizes pirates, painting them as freedom fighters and rebels with a cause. At other times it condemns them as the worst of criminals and murderers. It appears especially condemning of Jacobites, like Charles Vane and Blackbeard, which is interesting considering Mist's background and future, including his eventual exile. The condemnation of Jacobites has befuddled some. Is it a post-ironic promotion of Jacobite heroes? Were these chapters written by Daniel Defoe or somebody else working for the Whigs? Or was Mist trying to avoid unwanted attention? The attitude towards pirates in the book is impossible to decipher. They are simultaneously portrayed as freedom fighters and common criminals. But if Mist didn't write a general history alone, then who were his fellow authors? The biggest culprit would be, without a doubt, Daniel Defoe. Though the idea of Defoe being the only author was criticized and lost interest, the idea was picked up again by James Kelly. In the chapters on Henry Every and Captain Misson, he discovered multiple literary expressions unique to Defoe. They do not appear from any preceding authors. This leads serious credence to the idea of Defoe authoring at least these 2 chapters, perhaps more. Another study conducted on the chapter of Captain Bowen failed to find any resemblance to Defoe's style, indicating that it was written by someone else. There are 2 other candidates of interest. One is Captain Woodes Rogers. He was a privateer during the War of Spanish Succession, who managed to rise to stardom after publishing a journal of his travels. This fame led to him being made governor of the Bahamas, a position he used to essentially end Caribbean piracy. Events retold extensively in A General History. Shortly after his first governorship, he was imprisoned in London in 1721, after he failed to pay back his debtors. Mist had been imprisoned the same year, perhaps the 2 had met and talked things over. Rogers' own book had given him much fame, so he knew the effect which literature could have on a career. Indeed, A General History depicted him as a hero, and 2 years after its publishing, he received a pension from the king and was reinstated as governor of the Bahamas. However, even though Rogers' book and A General History bear some similarities, no research has seemingly been done to establish any definite connection between them. Rogers could have been a writer for the book, or simply an informant. Less known, but no less exciting, is John Atkins. He was a surgeon that partook in the hunt for Bartholomew Roberts, and participated as a register during the trial and hanging of his crew. In spite of these heroic deeds, Atkins only received a token payment, and much like the other shadowy writers previously presented, was in need of money. He returned to England 1 year prior to the publishing of A General History, and his contributions were flat out credited in the preface, likely as an advertisement for his own future books, in which he would likewise reference his involvement in A General History. His contribution was written by himself and published almost verbatim. They contain commentary on diseases and treatments, which only a surgeon could have made. Mist also appears to have had some minor names employed with the writing of the book. A document in the correspondence of one Charles de la Fay tells us that an assistant of Mist, Mr. Watson, was engaged in the editing of A General History on the behalf of Nathaniel. So there were possibly multiple unknown writers involved. Perhaps one day they'll be discovered by the style of their pen or some stroke of fortune, or perhaps they'll remain anonymous forever. But it certainly seems as if A General History was the brainchild of Nathaniel Mist, and a collaboration with Daniel Defoe, Woodes Rogers, and John Atkins. This shadowy cabal all had a common interest or background. 3 out of 4 were veteran sailors, 3 out of 4 had trouble with the law, all of them were prolific writers, and all of them needed money. These 4 factors serve as an excellent summary of the book itself, and provides a window into its intentions. Expert commentary on pirates, a popular topic, political and moral commentary hidden by allegory, spice it up with pop culture themes, and bam, you got an 18th century moneymaker. In terms of ideology, the context of Nathaniel Mist shows that A General History wasn't really an outlier. His newspapers had used pirate society as an allegory to talk about societal issues, and A General History was basically just such an extended article. A massive Lockean allegory. If you want to be cynical, propaganda piece. Authenticity and accuracy wasn't considered important, nor was it even expected. The seasoned 18th century reader was used to the blending of fact and fiction in popular crime stories, which A General History was. By using a popular subject, Mist and Defoe could successfully and subliminally broaden the audience for their oppositional ideas. So the book appears highly misunderstood in modern days. It is either held up as an accurate historical account, which it is not, or held up to modern standards of academia when it was never intended to be. The fault lies with us. I especially find Woodes Rogers' potential involvement to be the most interesting. He could have written the chapters on pirates he had a particular dislike of, owing to personal involvement. Men like Charles Vane, Blackbeard, and John Rackham. And these chapters are in fact the most inaccurate, and Blackbeard's essentially a slanderous hit piece. A page from a book belonging to one of Roger's colleagues was found inside a cannon aboard Blackbeard's ship, most likely not the only one. The two likely had a pickle. Indeed, Vane and Blackbeard were two of the most outspoken Jacobite supporters, whereas Rogers, unlike Mist, was an outspoken liberal, a Whig, and supporter of the new monarchy. This point of contention between Rogers and Mist likely explains the differing attitudes toward Jacobitism as presented in the book. However, their mutual need for money probably quenched this potential rivalry. Rogers could be considered the main protagonist of a general history, and appears as early as in the first chapter, the one on Henry Every. In this chapter, he travels to Madagascar, where he finds the surviving crew of Every being a downtrodden bunch of beggars, instead of the affluent princes of popular legend. Woodes Rogers did plan a trip to Madagascar, as he wanted to establish a colony there, and it is said that he stayed there for 2 months, but his exact interaction with the pirates there isn't entirely certain. His visit, as retold in a general history, was very likely written in by himself, both to paint the idea of piracy being futile, and also to paint himself in a better light. From a literary perspective, it is quite excellent. The hero who would end Caribbean piracy begins his journey by visiting the mythical cradle of both actual pirates and pop culture pirates, only to debunk the legend of their success. Owing to this team of ragtag authors, the nom de plume of Captain Charles Johnson becomes very reasonable. On one hand, Nathaniel Mist was too divisive to have the mass appeal needed. On the other hand, a non-existent person can become any person. None of the authors was Captain Charles Johnson. At the same time, all of them were. And anyone could become Captain Charles Johnson, the unseen face of 18th century pirate media. Lies, legends, half-truths, greed, plagiarism. A pirate of the printing press. Before the second volume could even be published, Mist had dived head-on into a second pile of stinking trouble. In 1727, the Weekly Journal published an allegorical article, the Persian Libel, condemning the current government. More than 20 people were arrested, the price of the issue skyrocketed, and the next year, when a more explicit issue made a direct attack on the royal family and ministry, the presses were smashed. The journal was renamed, and Mist fled across the Channel, to France, where he found employment with the exiled Stuart government. Back in England, the prince continued pushing out his books, without him receiving any money or credit. Ironically, it appears as though his involvement in A General History was an open secret in the publishing industry. Shortly after his flight from Old England, an anonymous pamphlet was published to ridicule him. Mist's closet broke open. It contains 15 messages between Mist and someone else. 2 of them are between Mist and Captain Johnson. This makes it obvious that the connection between them was well known. These 2 messages are elegies, a poem of serious reflection, usually intended to lament the dead, and both of them appear partially plagiarized from previous works. They are cryptic, especially in the context, and have a strange, dreamy sort of quality, so I will read them both in their entirety, though should you dislike them, you are free to skip to the timestamp on screen. The first one is titled Sea News, from Captain Johnson to Mist. Uniformity is a better prospect than variety. Putting to sea is a change of livelihood, but not of condition, where risings and fallings, calms and cross-scales are yours in order and turn, four winds but by chance. It may be better to have any wind than no wind at all. Your smooth-faced courtier, dreading your course, by a calm gives greater impediment than an open enemy's cross-scale. Levity is a virtue, for many are held up by it. It's neither so intricate or infinite to rig a ship as a woman. The more either is fraught, the apter they are to leak. To pump the one and shrew the other is like noisome. Small faults habituated are as dangerous as little leaks unfound. To punish and not to prevent is to labor in the pump and leave the leak open. It is best striking sail before a storm, and necessariest in it. To him that hath no haven, no wind is friendly. and yet it is better to have no haven than a bad conscience. Expedition is everywhere to be bribed, but at sea. The sound of commodity drowns the noise of a storm, especially of an absent one. I have once in my life outgone night at sea, but never darkness. And I shall never wander to see a hard world, because I have lived to see the son a bankrupt, being ready to starve for cold in his perpetual preference. A man's companions are, like ships, to be kept at a distance, from falling foul of one another. That the fairest field for a roaming head is the sea, where he may run himself out of breath, and his humour out of him too. Though a ship under sail be a good sight, yet it is better to see her moored in the haven, after having made a good voyage. Here I cast anchor. The second one is titled A Letter from Mr. Johnson, and reads as follows. Repentance without amendment is like continual pumping without mending the leak. He that lives without virtue sails without a compass. The wantonness of a peaceful commonwealth is like the playing of the propist before a storm. The fool is seasick in a calm, but the wise man's stomach endures all weathers. Passions in a fool are ordnance broken loose in a storm, that alter their property of offending others and ruin himself. Good fortunes are a soft quicksand, adversity a rock, both equally dangerous. Virtue is in poverty a ready-rigged ship that lies windbound. Good fashion in a man is like the pilot in a ship that does most with least force. A fool's tongue is like the buoy of an anchor, you shall find his heart by it, wheresoever it lies. Wisdom makes use of the crosses of this world, as a skillful pilot of rocks, for sea marks to sail by. Nathaniel's life went up and down before he eventually passed away in 1737, a poor and bitter man. However, a general history had taken on a life of its own, even within his lifetime. Between the printing of the first edition in 1724 and Nathaniel's death in 1737, a general history was revised and reprinted a total of 10 times. In 1725, it was translated into Dutch, German, and French, with old details lost in the translations and new ones added, further twisting and confusing the history. For example, the Dutch edition introduced the idea of Anne Bonny being a lesbian. Provided Nathaniel was the original creator of the book, it is impossible to know his involvement in the subsequent editions, especially after his flight from England. There is some evidence pointing to other printers stealing the book for themselves, or plagiarizing it into cheap knockoffs, often including poorly made woodcuts. Woodcuts in pre-modern times were difficult and expensive to make, so it was often cheaper to trace or copy from previous works, oftentimes leading to strange images. The clearest case of plagiarism comes from a book published in 1734, entitled A General History of the Lives and Adventures of the Most Famous Highwaymen, Murderers, Street Robbers, etc., to which is added a genuine account of the voyages and plunders of the most notorious pirates. Yeah, 18th century titles tend to be pretty long, often longer. What is so interesting about this edition is that it not only includes the old tales of pirates, but highwaymen also. Highwaymen lived a sort of parallel life to pirates in 18th century English media. People were fascinated with them, but the fascination was not equal. Pirates were viewed more negatively, yet with morbid curiosity, whereas highwaymen were more often admired. As for the stories of highwaymen in the book itself, it seems to be an edited, plagiarized copy of Captain Alexander Smith's History of the Lives and Robberies of the Most Notorious Highwaymen, first published in 1711. The combined book, attributed to Johnson, would be reprinted at several points in the 18th century. If one was unable to buy the book in one single go, 2 sheets could be given on a weekly basis, for a subscription of 2 pence. By this point, Johnson's actual identity becomes trivial. If one is able to attribute to him a previous, copied work by another author, possibly fictional as well, that proves his identity to be flexible, all-encompassing. Anyone can become Captain Charles Johnson. You, I. No one receives credit for work which was never truly theirs anyway, thus pushing the blame elsewhere into the world, leading critics into confusion and readers into misinformation. All that counts is the money trickling into the pockets of the printers, until another printer, also called Captain Charles Johnson, prints his own edition and sweeps his rivals off the floor. Captain Charles Johnson has defined pirate history for us. Whatever we do, wherever we go, we cannot escape his influence. But in spite of his attempts to moralize pirates, he very much ended up like them. Mythologized, estranged, ambitions to make a quick buck, appended by failure, treachery, and a cycle of robbery. Well beyond the 18th century, history books would plagiarize the book in turn and claim its stories as its own, not even bothering to use the alias of Johnson. Johnson and his associates are perhaps the true pirates of the Golden Age.